And the first one, of course, was that every single person that I interviewed absolutely knew and understood that there was an intelligence that was giving them life that they had to connect with, that they had to interact with and develop a two-way relationship with, that there is some unseen force, this power within us that's giving us life.
Welcome to Limitless Spark.
And I wanted to understand what this idea is. Who am I? As you learned this morning. And what am I doing here? And what is this all about? And got very, very passionate about science. And as I said this morning when we started, science to me is the contemporary language of mysticism. The moment you start talking about tradition or culture, or you talk about religion, you divide an audience, but science tends to unify a community. And if it's explained in a simple way, then it empowers people about themselves and to begin to come out of their resting state and apply it to see if you could have the experience of that philosophy so you can understand the truth or the wisdom behind it. And so after a period of time, I started getting very antsy, and I wanted to see if there were other people around the world that were sick or diseased in some way, and if they were treating conventionally or unconventionally, if they got better all of a sudden. And I wanted to know what the cause was that produced that effect. So I traveled to about 17 different countries, and I interviewed people that were diagnosed with cancer and diabetes and heart conditions and rare genetic disorders that medical science had no solution for, lupus and MS. And all of a sudden, these people had a very quick change in their health. And I wanted to know the correlation between the cause and the effect. And I started writing my first book called Evolve Your Brain, The Science of Changing Your Mind. And I was very passionate about the neuroscience of what people did in their mind. And so right around that time, the movie What the Bleep came out, and Will Arntz, the producer, writer, and director of What the Bleep, approached me and said, do you want to be in this movie? This is what it's about. We're going to marry quantum physics with neuroscience, with neuroendocrinology, with genetics. We're going to tell a story about emotions and past and how people perceive their reality. So I didn't think anything of it. I said, yeah, sure, I'll be in it. And they kept calling me up after the movie was done, and they kept saying, you're going to be a rock star. And I kept saying, I don't want to be a rock star. They kept saying, you're going to be a rock star. I said, I don't want to be a rock star. And the movie became an overnight sensation around the world. And after the movie, I went through a lot of personal changes, because when you're in a position where you're giving information to people, you have to also separate yourself from the ideal to the world and have the ideal for yourself. And I reached the point where I was so busy that I wasn't actually even practicing everything that I was talking about. So it was an opportunity for me again to separate myself from the world again and start to reevaluate what was important. And so when I wrote and finished Evolve Your Brain, there were 4 principles that I saw that were common to people that had spontaneous remissions from disease. And the first one, of course, was that every single person that I interviewed absolutely knew and understood that there was an intelligence that was giving them life that they had to connect with, that they had to interact with and develop a two-way relationship with, that there is some unseen force, this power within us that's giving us life, and that they took time out of their busy day to begin to interact with it, to give it a plan and a template, and then open their heart and surrender it to a greater mind and ask it to resolve it in a way that was right for them. And they made it very important. Basically, they said, when my will matches your will, when my mind matches your mind, and when my love and appreciation for life matches your love and appreciation for life, you have to answer the call. And so these people were common people. They weren't nuns or monks or priests or rabbis. They weren't scholars. They weren't academics. Some of them were, but most of them were common people just like you and I. And the second thing they had in common is that they understood that it was their own mismanagement of their life and their energy that created their disease. That they were living the majority of their life in a state of pain, in a state of fear, in a state of hostility, in a state of anger. And it was those emotions from past experiences that they were still carrying around with them, and those emotions were driving certain thoughts. And those thoughts were reinforcing certain emotions, and those emotions were driving the same thoughts. And the way you think and the way you feel creates a state of being. And I say that thoughts are the language of the mind and the brain, and feelings are the language of your body. And how you think and how you feel creates your state of being. And so these people got caught up in the cycle of thinking and feeling in the same way for so long that it became their familiar state of being. And they said that they had to break the habit of being themselves. That the redundancy of that cycle of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking over time conditions your body to memorize that state as well as your conscious mind. And whenever the body becomes the mind, that's called a habit. A habit is when your body is your mind. Now, 95% of who you are by the time you're 35 years old is a set of memorized behaviors and emotional reactions, beliefs and perceptions that function just like a subconscious computer program. So when people get about the business of change, and they're going to use 5% of their conscious mind to go against 95% of what they've memorized subconsciously, for the most part, the moment the person has a stray thought or reacts to something in their environment, they return back to the same self, and the program begins to run again. So if a habit is when the body becomes the mind, then to truly change then is to be greater than your body. To be greater than the emotional memories and addictions and habits and behaviors that keep us restrained to the same self. Now, what I learned from these people is that when we go from the old self to the new self, we have to cross this river of change. And the moment we no longer think the same way, or no longer act the same way, or no longer feel the same way, the moment we begin to become conscious of our unconscious self, that's the moment we step in the river of change. And the moment we step in that river of change, we no longer feel like ourselves any longer. And for most people, the moment you don't feel like yourself, your body, which has become the mind, sends a signal back to the brain to cause you to think equal to the way you've been feeling for the last 20 years. And so when we break that chemical continuity, the body as the mind wants us to return back to that familiar state of being. And if we listen to those thoughts as if they're true, those thoughts will always lead to the same choices. The same choices will always lead to the same behaviors. The same behaviors will always create the same experiences, and the same experiences will create the same emotions, and those same emotions will drive the same feelings, and the person will say, "This feels right." But in fact, it just feels familiar. Now, when we go from the old self to the new self, there is a biological, neurological, chemical, genetic death of the old self. There is a biological withering, breakdown of the old self that's connected to a feeling. And when you begin to understand that crossing the river of change, you're not going to feel like yourself any longer, and the body is going to go through its own breaking of addictions emotionally, then the best way then to predict in this place, this void, this unknown, is to create a new self. And these people actually began to do something amazing. They began to reinvent a new self. That's the third thing they understood, that they had to begin to think differently. Now, we think 60 to 70,000 thoughts in one day. Out of those 60 to 70,000 thoughts that we think in one day, 90% of those thoughts are the same thoughts as the day before. So the same thoughts will always lead to the same choices, yes? Same choices will always create the same behaviors. The same behaviors will create the same experiences, and the same experiences will always create the same emotions, and those same emotions will drive the same thoughts, and that's called a personality. And your personality creates your personal reality. That's it. And your personality is made up of how you think, how you act, and how you feel. So the present personality who's sitting here today has created their present personal reality called their life. Which means then, if you wanted to create a new personal reality, then you would have to start to think about what you've been thinking about, yes? And change it, yes? And you would have to begin to pay attention to those habits and behaviors and become conscious of them, yes? And then you would have to look at the emotions that you've memorized that keep you connected to the past and ask yourself, are these emotions loving to me? And so I realized that most people try to create a new personal reality as the same personality, and it doesn't work. We literally have to become somebody else.